In studying history, one is exposed to the tales of great individuals. These figures, like Christ, Dante, and Alexander the Great, give us models of what the good life is or could be, and teach us the different kinds of excellence that exist in the world. While in recent years we've been inundated by the accounts of secular heroes, if we turn to the annals of history, we have examples of very different kinds of men who sought to achieve different glories. The Buddha is one of these individuals. Born into great wealth and privilege, he voluntarily chose to renounce his inheritance, choosing to pursue the spiritual life rather than a worldly one as a king. In a previous video, we talked about the problem of death, the reality all human beings must experience, which ultimately makes our accomplishments meaningless. We've also confronted the fact that our achievements, even if we do accomplish great worldly things, will be eroded and forgotten due to the power of time. Based on this line of reasoning, we concluded that the most sensible life path was to pursue enlightenment and immortality, and said that if such phenomena existed and were the fruits of work, we should devote ourselves to that work as much as possible. The Buddha is one of the figures who pursued this line of reasoning. Living in around 500 BC, he predates Christ by 500 years, placing him in the same historical era as Confucius and Socrates. Given how far he lived in the past, it's difficult to say with absolute certainty what truths we know about the Buddha's life and what elements have been tinged by mythology. Despite this, even if we study only the mythology of the Buddha's life, we find it's very consciously devised, creating parables to teach us about the holy life, what good values are, and how we can emulate his path. In the Buddha's time, India was divided amidst a plurality of small kingdoms. In the tradition, he's the prince and heir of Magadha, one of these states in the upper Gangetic plain, and the great hope of his father and family. Here we should mention that the name Buddha itself is a title, meaning awakened one, similar to how Christ is a title, meaning the anointed one. And just like Christ's real name was Joshua ben Joseph, the Buddha's real name was Siddhartha Gautama, the name itself, Siddhartha, meaning one of noble attainment. While he had a deep interest in religion and spirituality, the Buddha did fulfill his hereditary duties as requested, marrying his wife Yashodhara like his family wanted, and birthing sons to carry on the family line. Yet after doing this, the appeal of religion proved too great, and he chose to renounce his inheritance and worldly life and become an ascetic. India at this time had developed a great spiritual tradition. They had religious pluralism, allowing people to select their beliefs. They had a large assortment of gods, though the most important were evolving into Vishnu, Shiva, and Kali. They had a tradition of yoga, meditation, and asceticism. Indian philosophy taught the ideas of reincarnation, that the soul returns to the body again and again. Karma, that you reap the moral consequences of your past actions. And moksha, liberation from the cycle of rebirth. Coming out of this culture, the Buddha's beliefs represent a focused distillation of the Indian spiritual teaching. The Buddha's innovations included the idea of anatta, or not self. He adopts a very specific philosophical perspective on the existence of the soul. In doing so, he stands apart both from the annihilationists who deny the soul and the eternalists who believe in it. The Buddha argues that there is a consciousness that persists life to life. However, it gets a form of total amnesia with each birth, and due to this lack of continuity, can't be identified with as a persistent self. In the mythology of Buddhism, when the prince is born, a fortune teller tells his father he'll either be a great king or a holy man. This causes the king to seclude his son and hide him from misfortune, sheltering him from the horrors of life. However, in the tradition, this ends up backfiring. When he is later exposed to the forces of old age, sickness, and death, called the three divine messengers in Buddhism, the Buddha becomes very disturbed and develops a desire to overcome them as a part of his life quest. So this encourages him to renounce his inheritance and fortune and pursue the holy life. His action shows the culture of India at this time. It was a highly spiritual civilization, where something like this would have been possible, if not admirable. The eldest son of a nobleman, giving up his rank and inheritance to explore spirituality. In the West, we have accounts similar to this, like St. Francis of Assisi, who gave up his own aristocratic birth to pursue the holy life. So the Buddha goes into homelessness, lives in the wilderness, and begins learning from spiritual teachers. Here you have to acknowledge the reality of the human condition, our fundamental state of ignorance, especially before the rise of the internet. The world exists on such a large scale, and there are so many phenomena that might exist, but we just don't know. Who is to say there isn't a teacher who's discovered a higher truth, who could change your life if you followed them? This means that the humble, like the Buddha, have a late start in life, having to catch up on all the human learning that's accessible to them before they can share their light with the world. The Buddha initially learns from two teachers who instruct him on how to have experiences in the spirit world, which we could interpret as the out-of-body experience. We touched on the practices they may have taught in detail in another video. Despite this, the conventional Indian teaching at the Buddha's time focused on tapas, or asceticism. And it was this idea: if you abandoned worldly life, renounced your possessions, and inflicted hardship on the body, it would cause this kind of inner alchemy that would transform the spirit and lead to enlightenment. So the Buddha dedicates himself to this practice for years. He dialogues with a lot of sadhus, or spiritual teachers, becomes extremely learned, in addition to what was already an aristocratic education, and he eventually develops his own teaching. In the tradition, they describe him as getting 5 followers. On reaching the age of 35, however, the Buddha becomes frustrated and goes through a kind of crisis. After maintaining his ascetic practice for an extended time, he hasn't experienced the results that were claimed. In the tradition, he's meditating in the wilderness one day, and he hears a musician and his teacher passing by on a boat, and they talk about the string of a musical instrument, how if it's too loose it won't play, and if it's too tight it will break. So from this he devises the idea of the middle way, the idea that Buddhism adopts a middle ground between the extremes of materialism and asceticism. The Buddha decides to stop fasting and punishing the body, and decides to leave the extreme homelessness of living in the wilderness behind. He loses his followers, who forsake him and think he's fallen away from the true path to enlightenment. Around this time, he has a memory that he recalls from childhood. In this memory, he's sitting in a field, he's in nature, he's at peace with himself in a kind of contemplative space, and he says he remembers this experience of feeling joy when he was meditating. And so this becomes his next pursuit, to apply himself to meditation, in the hopes this is the path to enlightenment. In Buddhism, they use the allegory of the Buddha sitting under the Bodhi tree to explain this period. If we unpack this myth, it gives us a template for what the spiritual path is and its stages of development. First, looking at the symbolism of sitting under a tree in the wilderness, we can see that the spiritual path is universally accessible, open to anyone who turns within. As the Buddha sits under the tree, he tries to achieve serenity in meditation but fails. In the allegory, he's assaulted by armies who attack him with flaming arrows. Like in Dante's philosophy, this represents the 7 deadly sins, the vices of greed and anger that pollute the mind. The Buddha is then tempted by a vision of alluring girls, showing the more subtle temptations of lust and desire. Overcoming both, the Buddha becomes virtuous and experiences peace and meditation. He is then attacked by Mara, the devil of Indian mythology. When the Buddha retains his equanimity, Mara tells him that he goes where no one else will dare, and asks if he will be his god. This symbolizes a state of earthly perfection, similar to the seeker reaching the height of purgatory in Dante's teaching. This is the idea that one can develop the soul of a deva, and consequently be able to presume spiritual immortality in the afterlife. The final part of the Buddha's work happens here, when he rejects what Mara says, and, pointing to the earth as his witness, states confidently that the mind, the individual self, does not exist. This results in the Buddha losing his sense of identification with himself as a discrete individual, transforming his consciousness to a new state of nirvana, one where his individuality merges in a state of unity with the divine. The tale of the Bodhi tree is an allegory and shows us what the spiritual life consists of, and is consistent with the works of other mystics from history, like Dante, Evelyn Underhill, Patanjali, and John of the Cross. In the tradition of Buddhism, after reaching enlightenment, the Buddha initially refuses to begin teaching. He concludes his attainment is too elusive, too hard to comprehend, for it to be worth sharing with others. Only after being asked to do so by one of the devas in a spiritual experience does the Buddha accept his duty and begin his ministry. When the Buddha begins teaching, he instructs people on the Four Noble Truths: that life is suffering, that the cause of our suffering is craving, that there is a way to overcome craving, and that this is done by following the Noble Eightfold Path. The Buddha then provides a template of the spiritual life in his Eightfold Path, explaining as consisting of the following stages. It begins philosophically with the cultivation of right view, a right understanding of the universe and man's place in it. It then involves an intellectual and moral cultivation of the individual, until one reaches the advanced stages of the inner life. The Buddha presents his teaching as accessible to lay people, but encourages his followers to become monastics like him if they seek to live through the entire holy life. Here we can look at the advanced parts of the Buddha's teaching, the seventh and eighth folds of the Eightfold Path. The seventh fold, samasati, or right mindfulness, suggests a cultivation of a state of self-awareness or meditation as a discrete practice. The eighth fold, or sama-samadhi, right ecstasy or absorption, suggests the religious experience should be a product of this practice. Here we run into two topics that arise in Buddhism: jhanas and the out-of-body experience. Jhanas are altered states of consciousness induced by meditation. They are states of bliss, joy, and equanimity that act as fortifications for the spiritual aspirant against the stress and turmoil of worldly life. If we review Buddhist literature and how these states are defined, we find one of the necessities is to translate our Pali and Sanskrit words into English correctly. When we read the suttas, the first jhana is defined by vitarka and vikara, applied and sustained attention, and the arising of piti and sukha, bliss and joy. The second jhana is characterized by the still mind. The third jhana is characterized by the arising of equanimity. And in the fourth jhana, one feels like one can meditate indefinitely. Jhana is essential to the premise of Buddhism. For its ascetic and idealistic teachings to be viable, we should be able to access a state of self-arising bliss that can function as a refuge. If you read early Buddhist literature, there are a series of dialogues between the Buddha and his disciple Ananda, whose name itself means without bliss. This could suggest an allegorical origin to Ananda's name, showing how essential it was for a neophyte to saturate his mind with jhana. If you've ever watched Rajneesh or Eckhart Tolle, this is one of the implications they seem to suggest with their personas, that they have attained a state of persistent, self-arising bliss as a product of meditation. Indeed, if this state existed, it by itself could resolve many problems in the human condition. If jhana exists in human psychology, we would have a refuge against the world and its adversities, a natural anxiolytic we could turn to abide in and revitalize ourselves. In the 2000s, an Indian spiritual teacher named U.G. Krishnamurti achieved celebrity for his book on the mystique of enlightenment. Having followed a spiritual path and learned from teachers like Jiddu Krishnamurti and Ramana Maharshi, U.G. had concluded that no higher state of consciousness existed. He argued instead for a kind of ethical atheism, retaining the structure of students conversing with him as a guru. Like the ancient Greeks, much of U.G.'s older years was spent in dialogues. He argued for sexual and social liberation, put no copyright on his ideas or books, and tried to expose the scams and cons he saw in the spiritual marketplace. A cynic like Yuji might suggest the Buddha was a narcissist like Rajneesh. Calling himself the Tathagata, or thus gone one, the Buddha even referred to himself in the third person. This implies he attained a permanent altered state of consciousness, experiencing a state of self-arising ecstasy, self-transcendence, or bliss. Yuji would have us inquire into the Buddha's practices to see if we can reproduce what he experienced. We should also assume that if the states of jhana independently exist, people should be spontaneously stumbling across them and rediscovering them. The Buddha's chief recommendation was to practice anapanasati. This involves observing the breath until one stills the mind and achieves quiescence. Self-simplify, sit or lie down, and watch the physical feeling of the breath going in and out of the nose. If this practice can bring reproducible results, resulting in the production of jhana, then we can conclude that the Buddha developed a complete philosophy. The other phenomenon to unpack in Buddhism is the out-of-body experience, which we can observe in the cosmology taught by the Buddha. We explored this topic in more detail in another video. In the suttas, the Buddha describes the different states of being in the universe. Consciousness can take the form of a human being, an animal, a ghost, a demon or asura, and a god or a deva. In Buddhism, one's karma or nature determines one's incarnation. If one is wise and virtuous, one can expect to be born as a nobleman or a deva. If one's soul is weighed down by malice and selfishness, one can expect to return as an animal, ghost or asura. This made the central goal of the Buddha's teaching to reach enlightenment, freedom from the cycle of rebirth. So the Buddha teaches us that we don't have to pursue wealth and power, that there are these other noble goals like self-transcendence and enlightenment that we can aspire for. In his teaching, the Buddha tells us not to waste time on asceticism, as it produces no results. He encourages the cultivation of virtue, wisdom, and meditation. He suggests the cultivation of right mindfulness, and through this states we should aspire for the two fruits of the contemplative life, jhana and the out-of-body experience, to prepare us for the fate of bodily death.